Hello and welcome to the Wilson Disease Association webinar on copper-conscious eating, nutrition support in the management of Wilson disease. Whether you were diagnosed years ago or quite recently and you have questions about the copper content of the foods you eat and the drinks you drink, this webinar is designed for you. I'm registered dietitian Carolyn O'Neil, and I will be your moderator for this program. I'm honored to be part of this webinar put together by the Wilson Disease Association because as a dietitian and a journalist who's focused on food and nutrition research and recipes, I truly believe that the more you know, the more you can eat. This is especially true for diets that limit certain foods or ingredients. You really have to have the best information so you're not unnecessarily limiting foods that you love or need for good health. Of course, every case is different, and that's why nutrition support is personalized to complement your medical treatment plan, and why we're so happy to have a registered dietitian who specializes in the management of Wilson disease on this program. Ann Marie Rivard, here's what's coming up later, is a clinical dietitian at the Yale University Medical Center, and that's one of the Wilson Disease Association's Centers for Excellence. Ann Marie will walk us through what we know today about the importance of limiting copper content in the diet, how to navigate and better understand those lists and charts revealing the copper content of specific foods, and perhaps most importantly, advice on how to plan a healthy, well-balanced diet for good nutrition and good taste for a lifetime. We will, of course, have time for your questions and your tips in the chat and during a Q&A session near the end. We will also be conducting some live polls to find out what you want to know about copper-conscious eating. So let's go to poll number 1. And here is our first question. Have you consulted a registered dietitian to help you manage a low copper diet? Yes or no? Well, while we wait for the polling results to arrive and get busy answering that, I want you to know that we'll also be hearing from 2 patients living with Wilson disease, Kalt and Amanda Elsts. They will share their very different stories on the challenges and the triumphs of limiting copper in their diets. Let's see if we have some poll results now that we could share. Well, look at that. The majority so far have responded that no, they have not consulted a registered dietitian. So you're in luck today because we've got one on the webinar. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, including your questions, so let's get started. Okay, Copper 101. First of all, what is copper? And why is it so important for people with Wilson disease to manage their copper intake with the foods and the beverages that they choose? Let's watch this very short video.
Wilson disease is a rare genetic disorder that causes excess copper to be stored in the body. The disease is progressive, and if left untreated, can cause liver disease, brain damage, and premature death. To understand Wilson disease, it's important to first know the role that copper has in helping the body function. Copper is an essential element that supports the nervous system and immune system and helps make blood cells. Typically, copper is absorbed from the foods we eat. The ATP7B gene provides instructions to produce a transporter protein that moves excess copper out of the liver. Wilson disease is caused by mutations or changes to the ATP7B gene. The transporter protein doesn't function properly, meaning its activity level is low or absent. So excess copper stays in the liver. It builds up and becomes toxic throughout the body. Symptoms typically begin due to liver dysfunction during childhood or teenage years. Signs of advanced liver dysfunction can include chronic fatigue and yellow discoloration of the skin. And a small number of people with the disease will experience severe liver failure. But in some cases, liver disease may progress silently, while patients initially develop symptoms from the effects on the brain, such as tremors and difficulty speaking or moving. For some, the effects of Wilson disease can be prevented or treated by lifelong medical treatments that are often given daily to lower copper in the body to non-toxic levels.
Now, I'd like to introduce you to 2 patients who have been diagnosed with Wilson disease. First up is Kalt. Laura is a registered dietitian by training and works for a major retailer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was diagnosed nearly 25 years ago, so has a lot of experience navigating a low copper diet. Let's meet Laura. Well, hello, Laura, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us in the webinar today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, first of all, when were you diagnosed with Wilson disease, and what was the situation for you? Everybody has such a different story.
Okay, I actually had to look back at when it was. It's a long time ago. But in 1998, I was diagnosed. I was actually attending one of the national dietetic conferences in Washington, D.C., and had a cholesterol check there and found out that my cholesterol was under 100. Which is extremely low. So they said, better see your doctor when you get home to Milwaukee, which is what I did. Saw my regular doctor, who sent me after some lab tests to a gastroenterologist, who said this is either an autoimmune disease or Wilson's disease, but Wilson's disease is very rare. So that would be not typical. I was diagnosed with Wilson's then after the liver biopsy. So that confirmed my diagnosis, and I definitely was had the hepatic side of the disease. Some people have the neurological, but I clearly have the hepatic, where they're monitoring the liver enzymes.
So you were put on one of the chelators at that time, and what were you told about diet? What were you told about copper in the diet and what to do?
Right, pretty much he said you're going to follow a low copper diet, the best that you can. They gave me a handout of a list of foods with copper in it and said, try to stay under 2 milligrams a day and record what you're taking in for a few weeks just to see where we're at and how much we need to reduce to get to the 2 milligrams. But basically the rule of thumb at that time was to avoid the high copper foods, like the shellfish, the nuts, the chocolate, the mushrooms. I miss the mushrooms more than the chocolate. So I still do eat some of those foods, and I am being monitored twice a year with labs and the 24-hour urine.
Okay, now you are also a registered dietitian, which means we are trained to identify nutrients in food and help people follow special diets. Even though you're a dietitian, did you find it challenging to avoid high copper foods and understand high, medium, low, what to do?
Absolutely. Dietitians are great at giving the information, but following the advice is another story. I actually looked back at a textbook, and there's less than a paragraph about Wilson's disease. So there isn't a lot of information, and thank goodness for the Wilson's Disease Association providing more information. But it's misleading, and I think it's challenging to figure it out. And every person handles it different based on their situation. So I think I am in close contact with my GI doctor, and as long as things are going well, I feel like I'm following the best that I can.
Let's dig in a little bit to the food arena here. And you mentioned shellfish. You were in Milwaukee, maybe not a lot of shellfish on the menu. Well, of course, you can get them anywhere now.
Right.
But the thing is, like, even those charts, you look at them and you think, well, where were these potatoes from? Where was this shellfish from? Is it dark chocolate? Is it milk chocolate? Again, as a dietitian, what were the questions you had in your mind?
Yeah, when you do a lot of digging and research into this, you see that the copper content of even a potato varies by the climate and the type of soil that is involved. So there's a lot of variation. Drinking water, there's a lot of variation. Are you drinking the tap water? Are you drinking bottled water? There's a lot of things, and there's really no cookbooks with recipes and, hey, follow this for Wilson's disease. So you're left a bit on your own.
Well, you were bumping into 25 years having been diagnosed with Wilson disease. What is still the number one question you have about the copper content of food?
I think just where should you really look for it? What is the real answer? And every gastroenterologist, every dietitian has a different suggestion. And I think you have to take it as individual, and what is right for one person might not be right for another. Certain people have the neurological symptoms, and they can tell directly an effect based on what they eat. myself, I don't know. If I eat lobster, I will have no symptoms, but how does it affect my liver and my lab tests when I have them?
Well, Laura, that's why we're here today, and that's why we're having this webinar to try to get a handle on some of these questions, what we know, what we don't know. Thank you so much, and let the show continue.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Laura. Now let's meet Amanda Elsts, who lives in Indiana and has enjoyed a career in wardrobe design. While Amanda is relatively new on her journey with Wilson disease, she's come up with some pretty innovative ways to incorporate a low copper diet into her lifestyle. And she shares that on her blog, The Copperless Chick. So let's meet Amanda. So great to see you here today. Why don't we get started by asking you your story about when you were diagnosed and what was going on in your life that you thought, gee, there's something wrong here.
Well, back in 2016, I was getting sick on and off, like just that fall into the winter. And it just was really strange because my immune system's not normally that bad. And then the next thing I know, my dizziness is turning into my body is moving on its own and it's making me dizzy. My head is moving around like a bobblehead and my arms are flailing. I'm having tremors and crawling my way to and from the bathroom or kitchen. And I'm like, I gotta go to the doctor. And when I went, they were just like, oh, well, you're just depressed and stressed and we'll just give you some antidepressants. And I'm like, okay, well, thank you. So 8 doctors later, I finally find a doctor that is really interested in helping me. And he's like, no, this does not look normal. And we should be looking at some neurological diseases for this. So we went through MS and Parkinson's and, you know, the long list. And he finally is like, okay, this is a rare disease, but I think that's the area we're in now. We've been going at this for 6 months. So let's just see if it's Wilson's disease. And sure enough, it was. I have the neurological end of Wilson's disease. And I started off on chelators.
Wow. So you found your diagnosis. And what were you told to do besides taking the chelators to help manage your Wilson disease?
I was told that I should do a low copper diet, which was incredibly intimidating because after he told me, he's like, and copper's in all the food, good luck. And I was like, okay, so do I go talk to a dietitian? What's the next thing that I do? And I didn't have any dietitians that were really interested in helping me with that because, again, not really talked about. So that was a new, very scary thing to try and navigate.
And you're really good at research. So obviously you Googled it, you did all that, to find out what the high, low, medium copper, really to set up your own low copper kitchen. And the reason that was important is you really felt they were very sensitive to copper and you had a way of tracking, not that everybody else has to do this, but let me share your document and tell us what we're going to be looking at.
Yes. So this is something I developed after I noticed after having nuts one night and the next day my symptoms were so much worse. I was like, okay, I've got to figure out a way of monitoring which high copper foods have so much effect on my body. And I know this, like not everyone pays attention to their body like this, but I do. So if you look in it's towards the top of the upper left, you'll see new, and that would be where you would put chocolate or whatever foods that you're trying there. And then you have your X's and check marks, and you would say whether you did it or not. And then the bottom part is more filling out atmospherically what's happening to you, and then also what's happening to your body, so you can monitor those things throughout the month.
Very specific and certainly your own personal research. Back to copper and the copper list, you have also developed some charts that have to do with cooking and shopping. What are some smart swaps that you have for avoiding high copper foods?
Yes, I recently put together my Smart Swap chart, and it has like the swap for chocolate and carob chips and light and dark meat, and for soy, you would change it to coconut aminos.
And understand you also have substitute for raisins.
Yes, raisins, you can get yourself some craisins, and the low copper is awesome with those. And the flavor is kind of more interesting, I think, than just your average raisin. So.
Like that there's a high point there to finding substitutions for the high copper foods. But I think everyone is joining pretty much this webinar today because it's not easy to keep track of high, low, medium copper foods, and then to shop, to eat, to cook, to enjoy your life and be healthy overall. What is your number one thing you wish you knew more about in terms of the copper content of food, like the missing link?
I wish that there was really a site that you really could just go and find all of your foods and be able to see the copper content, whether it's 0 or 1,000,000, I don't care, but like just that it would be up there and ready to lock and load. And there's the USDA site, but it's a little difficult to navigate and you have to really know what you're looking for and how to use it. And then there's some big holes of like different name brands and things that aren't on there for that particular use. So.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. And that is where we're headed next, to find out more about the copper content of foods. So stay tuned, and thank you, Amanda. Wow, so great to hear from Laura and Amanda. And they will be here during the Q&A session if you have any questions for them as well. Wow, as we've just learned, managing Wilson disease by limiting copper in the diet really varies from patient to patient. So now we want to hear from you in polling question number 2. Are you ready for this? Here we go. What bothers you the most about those copper content of foods lists? Is it categories are too broad? Is it difficult to determine portion sizes? And conflicting information, does that bother you? So we see some of the results already. That looks like conflicting information is leading the pack at this moment. And the categories are too broad. Maybe people don't feel that, but we see it populating there. And what's terrific is, and that's why we're here with the Wilson Disease Association to help give you the information you need to address these questions. And even more, we turn to Ann Marie Rivard, who's a registered dietitian nutritionist with the Wilson Disease Center of Excellence at the Yale University Medical Center. Ann Marie is a clinical dietitian at the Yale New Haven Hospital. Welcome, Ann Marie. And first, as a registered dietitian, how did you get involved in the management of Wilson disease? It's such a specialty.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to share my story here and hopefully some light on this topic. I was hired into Yale in 2005 in the transplant dietitian role. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Michael Shilsky was hired in as the medical director of the liver transplant program. So we started working together in that arena. And then I learned more about his specialty in Wilson disease and started seeing a few of his patients here and there and really realized the need for nutritional guidance in this population, how much ambiguity was out there. So started to learn more about it, started to become involved in various projects with Dr. Shilsky, as well as direct patient care, and find myself here today still in both worlds, the transplant and the Wilson disease world.
Well, it's so wonderful to have a registered dietitian nutritionist on the medical team. And certainly as we're addressing copper, obviously dietitians are the ones who keep track of what's in our foods, hopefully, and what's in our diets. So let's go to copper now. What is it? What do you tell your patients and families? Why do we need copper? What happens when there's too much or maybe even too little?
Right. So copper, which many of us don't realize, is a metal that's essential for our bodies. It acts as a cofactor or a helper to a lot of different processes in our body. So as we saw in the video, it's directly linked to energy production in our body, red blood cell production, the health of our brain and nerves, and collagen production for bone and skin and muscles. So we can see it's so closely linked. If there's too much or too little, there's definitely some complications. Too little, we can see anemia, we can see challenges with osteoporosis and bone health or rheumatoid arthritis. And then too much, as we saw in the video as well, there's damage potentially to the liver from copper accumulation there, potentially leading to end-stage liver disease. There's also neurologic damage, so tremor, challenges, trouble with speaking, changes to movement. So definitely can affect our body in multiple ways.
And it's interesting, this leads up to our next question, is why do you prefer then to refer to the diet as copper conscious? And don't people with Wilson disease are often handed, again, that sheet of paper for a low copper diet. So what's the difference there, and how do you think that helps people make that make choices more easily or better?
Yeah, so the recommendations have really been very vague over the years. As our two speakers showed already, they receive different information, and it's kind of just, here's a handout of some foods that have copper, maybe don't eat them. So some sites tell you don't eat these 5 foods, others say add up to so many milligrams per day. So it's really challenging to figure that out. And as I've done more research and learned over the years, I've found that neither extreme is really good. So if people don't even worry about copper in their diet, that's a great tool we have control over that you are not using. So I think completely ignoring it is definitely not beneficial. But then on the other side, if you're overly restrictive, we don't have research that supports that shows if you have a super strict copper diet, then outcomes are going to be this much better. Also, we know that there's a lot of stress with that. As our speakers said, trying to figure out what that means, how to plan their diet, it's really hard to micromanage your copper intake. The other thing that's interesting is your body is pretty smart, and if you overly restrict your copper intake, it naturally will increase the amount of copper you absorb from your food. We don't absorb 100% of all the copper we eat. Maybe we absorb 30% or 40%. But when people restrict their diet very low, the body can absorb as much as 75% of it. So sometimes over-restricting kind of backfires. Also, if you're going to only choose low copper foods, you're going to be avoiding a lot of really nutritious foods. The foods that are high in copper are also high in other vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. So we don't want people completely cutting those foods out of their diet that do have research benefits to health. And then lastly, I would say with children as well, we want to keep the diet really broad for them. They are developing their taste palette, they're growing, they're setting their nutrition foundation for life. So we can't overly restrict them. So that's why I came to the conclusion of a copper conscious diet, using it as a tool in our diet, being aware of it, but not having it be overly restrictive, and also remembering it doesn't replace medical management, encouraging you to work closely with your physician, stay on a good medical regimen, and then use this tool to complement your therapy.
And as we keep saying, one size does not fit all. So again, the importance of working with somebody to help you manage it. And wow, just the caution of having too little when copper is made out to be a foe, not a friend, when you're diagnosed with Wilson disease. Well, let's get into the nitty gritty of being a copper content detective, if you will. What are the foods that jump out the most on the most wanted list, if you will, of those to avoid, and kind of walk us through maybe the low, the moderate, the high? And it's so great to have a dietitian's eye on these charts that we're about to see, and many of you may have seen them before and not had a dietitian help you navigate. So lots of information. Why don't we go to that slide, your first slide, and it's great to have a dietitian kind of decode what we're seeing here.
Sure. So first and foremost, I want to say, just when you see copper content referenced, you're going to see micrograms, you're going to see milligrams, just to kind of talk about what those words mean. So really, it's most important in the first year of treatment, or anytime there's an increase of symptoms or a big change in your treatment regimen. That's when you want to be the most conscious of copper intake. And that's usually when the diet is 1 milligram per day. Now, a milligram is the same as 1,000 micrograms. So microgram is the smaller measurement. So really 1 milligram or 1,000 micrograms per day is what we consider a moderated diet anytime you need that slightly stricter diet. But it's really not practical to add up every single food you eat every day, keep a running log, and try to get to that 1 milligram. So that's why I think of foods in kind of the low, medium, high. In these categories, they are a little bit fluid, because as I learn new information, both from my own research and from patients directly, a lot of times I have patients come to me and say, look, I found this, and we'll look at it together and realize there is some new information. So the categories do change. So I don't want this to be taken as this is exactly what I have to eat and I have to follow this strict diet. This is really just to guide food choices. So first and foremost, I would say we recommend not eating liver. Liver, because that's where the copper is stored, tends to be highest in copper. It can have up to 11 milligrams per serving, when we just talked about that 1 milligram limit for some people. So that is a food that should be avoided without reason. And then if we look at the rest of the high copper foods, there's a couple that are starred there, and we consider those quite high in copper. Those are mostly the shellfish, so the lobster, oysters, clams, crabs, squid. Those should definitely be avoided within the first year, and then really minimized after that, maybe once or twice a year or so. The one shellfish that's an exception is scallops. For whatever reason, scallops tend to be lower in copper, so we put that into the low copper section. With the remaining high copper foods, we recommend just really limiting those in the first year. And then once stable on treatment, being mindful of how often they're consumed and really only having one at a time. So you can see on their dried fruits, except the cranberries, as Amanda mentioned, those are low. And then we can go, the nuts and seeds and soy products also listed on there. So that would be another high food. So we can go to the next slide and see a few more categories of foods. So you can see the dried beans, legumes, bran products, soy products, and foods that contain dark chocolate. We'll talk about that in a moment. But those are also high copper foods that should be tried to avoid in the first year and then moderated after. And then we can go on to the next one, which is the last section of foods. Just a few of the vegetables that are higher. And then you can see that moderate section. We recommend going ahead and enjoying those foods, but just keeping them to the portion size listed. So no need to avoid them.
I'm sorry, Ann Marie, is that an example when you say enjoy? We all hear eat your vegetables, right? So this might be something you say, the benefits might perhaps outweigh the risks in the moderate category, whereas the high copper, lima beans and sweet potatoes with skin. So maybe the copper lives in the skin. I mean, this is so interesting.
Yes, exactly. So we definitely want to include these foods and have variety. But as we'll talk about at the end, I refer to building the base of your diet with the lower foods and then alternating in some of the moderate and higher foods. So,
Ann Marie, sorry to interrupt, but a lot of our attendees, of course, are hungry for this information. But not to worry, folks, you don't have to jot this down or take a photo of the screenshot. If you want to, you can. But these resources will be housed on the Wilson Disease Association Copper Conscious Eating pages, which we are building now. So go ahead, Ann Marie, with the rest of the guide.
Yeah, so I was going to move on and show our next graphic because not every food fits into these categories. So you're not going to find every food you eat on that list. So what do you do if there's something that's not listed on there? Before, Amanda referenced the USDA database, and that's actually changed in the last couple years. They've kind of changed how they're presenting the information. So now it's called Food Data Central. It's managed by the Agricultural Research Service and hosted by the USDA. They launched it in April 2019, and they update it every 6 months. So it does have updated information on it. So that's the website there. So if we go to the next graphic, you can see what it looks like when you do put a food in the search category there. You'll see 5 tabs come across the top there, and those are the different data sets they use. The first tab, Foundation Foods, that's the main data set for the public to use. So over time, they're going to try and expand the number of basic foods in here and ingredients. So this is really the ideal place for us to look for copper content. The second one, there's the legacy one. That was the primary site data set for public use in the past. When they went to Food Data Central in 2018, they stopped updating this. So the information is correct and accurate up to April 2018. So you will find information there, but we don't know if that's changed over the years. The next 3 are not going to be used as often. So survey foods is by one specific data set we had, which is not too applicable. The branded foods is by food companies submitting information on their branded products, but oftentimes doesn't contain copper. And then the last one is experimental foods. So those are foods grown in certain unique conditions that are really used for research purposes. Those first 2 tabs is where you're going to want to refer to.
Thank you. In preparation for our interview, I did kind of click around the Food Data Central to do a little copper research just to kind of walk the walk and talk the talk. And it is actually hard. And sometimes it says nothing found. And you're like, wait a minute, what do you mean nothing found? Or in the branded area, I think a lot of times the brands that like to say that they are a great source of copper because it's an important nutrient for, people who don't have Wilson disease and they don't have to monitor it. You'll find it there, but that is not one of the, the all-stars that is being measured in foods today, unfortunately, and hopefully that will change as we move along. Yeah. I know that you wanted to show another slide there, and that was a specific one for lobster, and I think this really tells a good story.
Yeah. So it's interesting because when you look up a food, you're going to get a bunch of different options and you're trying to figure out, okay, which one is the food that I'm eating? What is the species? Is it cooked? Is it raw? So playing around with that and seeing there is going to be some variation, and it's not going to be necessarily directly applicable to the exact food you're eating, but trying to get an estimate of how high, moderate, or low that food is. We also have to keep in mind portion size. So the default is to put it to 100 grams. That's their standard reference. Most of us don't think of food in a weight-based setting in the US. So if that's not a usual measurement for you, some of them do have them in more common household measurements, which you can see the drop-down menu there. You can change it to cups or ounces for some foods, not all of them though. So really doing your best to figure out kind of what's the exact food you're eating, but knowing that there's probably going to be some variation. Also a note that this does not work well on mobile devices. So if you're using this, ideally a desktop or a laptop will be the way to get the best experience.
That's very interesting because one of our polling questions, of course, was about portion sizes. And, you can look up and see what the copper content of, let's say, avocado is. Let's use that as an example, which is a source of copper, I understand. And but people love avocado. It's like one of the favorite foods in the world right now, So what is your recommendation specifically? I'm just wondering for avocado.
Yeah, so it's definitely fine to include. So that is going to be fairly moderate. We want to monitor the portion size of it, which we would recommend in general, because even though it is a great heart healthy fat, foods that are higher in fat do have a lot of energy density to them, caloric density. So we don't need a lot of them. So I think some of the health benefits you're going to get from that are definitely going to outweigh the occasional copper content. So including that in your diet in moderation for sure, and just watching the portion size.
And just getting ready for our next question here in our conversation, again, I was clicking around on the USDA Food Data Central and looking at lobster. And one thing I noticed was that, if you go to the Caribbean, they have the lobsters without the claws, the spiny lobster. And then, of course, the lobster that we think of as the one with the claws, like the Maine lobster, homard. And it's very interesting how different that was. It was like you could have 100 grams of the spiny lobster on your vacation in the Caribbean, and it has just 0.38 milligrams, whereas the northern lobster, 100 grams, is 1.3, so almost 3 times as much. So what do you wish we knew more about? We can talk about shellfish here, we can talk about chocolate here, but again, the variations within the choices.
And that's the thing that's going to be so challenging. There is a lot of variation between different types, where they were grown. We've learned a lot from plants, the type of soil they're grown in, the water, the climate. That's going to change how much nutrition they absorb from that soil. It changes the copper content as well as many other minerals. Same with the different species or varietals, like you mentioned, with the lobster or with salmon. When you go out and order salmon, you're not thinking, is this sockeye salmon? Is this wild, Atlantic? Is it farmed? But all of those different conditions change the amount of nutrition and the amount of copper in that food. So I encourage people to not get too caught up in the exact numbers, because you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to figure out exactly how much you're having, but trying to know in general, this is roughly the category this food fits into. So this is what I'm going to do for myself, eat it this many times a month or a year to make sure that your treatment is going well. You mentioned the chocolate too. That's another big one. So people hear chocolate and think, okay, I can't have any chocolate for the rest of my life now. But knowing the type of chocolate makes a big difference. So the copper is actually from the cacao fruit, which is the fruit of the tree that makes this bean. And that's where the copper is housed. So the more of that cacao that's in the chocolate, the more of that copper. So if we look at a standard milk chocolate bar, it doesn't have as much of that in. That might only have 0.18 milligrams, 18% of that 1 milligram per day. whereas a very high dark chocolate bar has 0.75 milligrams, or 75% of that 1 milligram per day. And that's kind of challenging because dietitians normally tell you to eat the dark chocolate. That's where more of the nutrition is, more of the minerals, including the copper. So that's what makes it so challenging. But knowing that you can have almost all of these foods in some form, as long as there's some moderation and some thought about how concentrated it is.
And since the dietitian is in today, we know that one size does not fit all, certainly when it comes to food preferences and diets. What about folks who are switching more to a plant-based, vegetarian, or vegan diet today? What should their concerns be if they're managing their copper intake as a Wilson disease patient?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot because people will look at these charts and come to me and say, you know, I normally follow a vegetarian diet, but everything I eat, nuts and beans and soy and tofu, is in that high list. Should I not be doing a vegetarian diet? The thing that we have to realize is that dietary copper from plant sources is actually less bioavailable. So what that means is our body has a harder time pulling the copper out of that food than an animal-based product. It's a little easier for our body to absorb the mineral content of that food. So it's unclear if the higher amount of copper in the plant-based foods really makes that much of a difference because our body absorbs so much less of it. We also know there's a lot of health benefits to having more of a plant-based diet and having some variety. So I work with patients closely to help them follow this diet if that's their choice, and show them that it is reasonable to do that as long as we think of the portion size of what they're having. Also keeping in mind too that meat substitutes are becoming more and more popular. We find, you know, the non-meat burger and chicken alternatives, those are normally made with a high copper protein source. So a pea protein, a bean, or a soy protein. So again, they're going to be higher in copper, but since they're plant-based, maybe not absorbed as well. So can be included in the diet. Alternate if it works for you with a lean meat so that it's a little bit of both. And then if you are somebody that is a lacto-ovo vegetarian, you include milk and eggs in your diet. Those are very low in copper and great protein sources. Or if you're a pescatarian, you do include fish. Those are also low copper ways to add in some protein. So definitely doable to go more towards the plant-based and still need more research on kind of what that difference in absorption means for our total body copper.
Well, of a lot of exciting areas for those who are researching copper content of foods, that's for sure. Get to work, folks. Why don't we go to another polling question and listen from our attendees? And this is number 3. Which of these health issues are a concern to you to support your optimal health? A, liver disease, B, cardiovascular disease, C, cancer, D, diabetes, or E, mental health. And Ann Marie, I turn to you because Wilson disease often has an effect on other organs in the body, such as the liver and the brain. And what role does nutrition play for those who might have some of these overarching health complications?
Sure. So those at Wilson disease, as we saw earlier, are at risk of liver disease due to the copper accumulation. And liver disease, unfortunately, is on the rise in the general population, especially fatty liver disease, where there's an increased buildup of fat storage in the liver. Prevalence has been found to be anywhere from 10 all the way up to 45% of the U.S. population. So it's really important to think about eating for liver health in general, and especially that much more important for those with Wilson disease. So we can pull up the next graphic and show how we use the MyPlate model to teach towards nutrition. So maintaining liver health involves striving towards a healthy weight with good energy intake, good balance at meal times, which we'll talk about with the graphic, avoidance of alcohol intake to not further damage the liver, and then minimizing added sugar and salt intake in our diet. So the MyPlate graphic is what we use when we teach nutrition in general to the general population, but definitely can be applicable to the situation of somebody with Wilson disease trying to maintain liver health. So it shows you about half of your plate should be a fruit or a vegetable base. A quarter of your plate should be a grain or a starch. So whether it's rice or other grains or starchy vegetables like potato. And then a quarter of your plate should be a protein, whether it's a lean lean meat or egg or bean-based protein. So if we strike this balance, we're automatically going to be moderating copper intake by not overdoing portion size and also helping to eat towards liver health. Research continues to point to the role of nutrition in the risk for liver disease. There was research that showed that a high-calorie diet that was enriched with fat and with sugar actually sped up liver damage in a Wilson disease rat model. So following more this type of eating plan as opposed to one which is higher in fats and sugar can slow down the risk of liver damage. It gets to be more and more challenging though, because those types of foods that are enriched with sugar or salt are so prevalent in our diet now. Over the past 100 years, it's increased by 3 to 5-fold of how much sugar we're putting into our diet. And the biggest increase was seen in children. So we find our cereals and our baked goods and our drinks, quite sweet. And even things that don't taste sweet to us, savory things like ketchup and pasta sauce. Those things we don't think of as sugar content laden, but they are. They add it for flavor to that. So research is still ongoing, but it's pretty evident that this rapid increase in sugar intake can have a negative impact on health, especially for those with Wilson disease. So we recommend being mindful of added sugar. The way that we think about it in terms of measurements is that women should try to limit it to about 6 teaspoons of added sugar or less per day, whereas men should limit it to about 9 teaspoons or less. So you can see here the food label we have pulled up. This is a larger multi-serve container of yogurt. So you can see when you read that, the total sugars is listed there, and then under that is added sugars. So the food is not
right? That's relatively new to the nutrition facts label because everyone is supposed to be paying attention. And it was nice to know that I guess there's natural sugars, of course, in yogurt because it's lactose, right, from the milk. This might be, the fruit preserves that's added there. So that's an interesting example, an important example.
Exactly. So looking at that added sugars means what was added beyond what existed in the food to begin with. So this has 16 grams of sugar. So you say, okay, 16 grams, like what does that mean? Again, we're not really focused on weight-based. Is that a lot? Is that a little? So you always want to take that number and divide it by 4. If you divide it by 4, that tells you how many teaspoons it is. And that's a much better visual reference for us. So that's 4 teaspoons. So think of sitting down, here's your cup of yogurt, and then you're putting 4 teaspoons full of sugar into that and stirring it in. So that's how much sugar is in that. The thing we can't forget though is portion size. So we're serving ourselves out of this large container. How much are you eating? So you can see up at the top, the serving size is 3/4 of a cup. So that might not be a very lot. If you get out, your bigger cereal bowl and you put the yogurt in there, maybe you're having twice that. Now maybe you've had 8 teaspoons of that, and you can see how quickly it can add up. So just being aware of it, again, doesn't mean you can't have that. Dietitians are the first to tell you that, we have candy in our offices and love our sweets, but being mindful of the portion sizes and how quickly it can add up throughout the day. The other thing you had mentioned was, go ahead.
I say one thing we're not going to see on the nutrition facts label, of course, is the copper content. I guess we only see the major nutrients that might be gap nutrients, I understand, in the general population. That's why they list, calcium and a few of the other ones are potassium. So what your advice is saying, while we're focused on copper here, it really is about looking at overall health and nutrition for the prevention of some of the major diet-related diseases that a Wilson disease patient may be at risk for, as we mentioned, heart disease, diabetes. And so your role as a dietitian in the management of Wilson disease really is a bigger picture than copper.
Exactly. So even if people say I know the copper, I have that down, there's usually still a lot we can talk about in terms of overall diet quality and preventing some of these long-term complications. If complications have been occurred, unfortunately, that's where dietitians get even more involved, especially with the neurologic complications. Sometimes we need to do altered food consistencies if people are having trouble swallowing, thickened liquids if people are, having trouble getting water to go down the right way and are aspirating or getting it into their lungs. Or sometimes we need to use tube feeding if people don't have the ability to swallow because of their neurologic involvement. So a lot of other ways that nutrition is involved in treatment at that point.
You have another important graphic, and again, we'll be sharing these resources with everybody. And this is sort of your cheat sheet, if you will. I'll call it that, on what to purchase, which I love, because so many times we have diet information, which is what not to do or not to eat. And what I love about this one, and it is the one that's called What to Purchase, that would be slide, there we go, 17. And I know it's hard to read, folks, because it's tiny, but essentially you want people to know what they can buy.
Exactly. And again, that's what dietitians so often focus on. Don't eat this, don't eat that. And that's why people, I think, get frustrated. But there are a lot of good things out there that you should be including in your diet. So I've put this together to help guide people in their food choices based on the different categories. So with produce in general, trying to buy when in season if you can. There's a link there on how to check what the seasons are. Using frozen without added sauces or canned in 100% juice or no added salt. You can sometimes get almost as much nutrition because they're frozen or canned right at the point of high peak nutrition. So with the fruits and veggies there, I have a list of what you should start with. Those are the lowest copper choices, but then alternate in with some of those other higher copper choices. Definitely can have them, but just have those come in for variety. With grains, this is the same nutrition recommendation we give to the general population, is to make half of your grains whole. So choosing whole grains about 50% of the time, that will help to moderate copper content because it's higher in the whole grain foods. So alternating some of the more whole grains and some of the more refined grains so you have a balance. With protein foods, choosing leaner options, they tend to be lower in copper and also are overall better for health in terms of liver and heart health. But again, alternating in if you want to have beef, if you want to have pork, if you want to do the nuts and seeds. There's definitely some health benefits to all of those foods. So not having that be the base of your diet, but having that come in occasionally. Dairy foods are almost all quite low in copper. So trying to choose lower sugar options, and then beverages, trying to again choose lower sugar options, having water tested at home. And then with mineral water, this I've spent a lot of time trying to look into. Likely is not going to be excessively high in copper, but just not enough information right now. So in general, I just recommend people not use mineral water until we know more about it. And then alcohol, really minimizing alcohol intake to kind of give the liver a bit of a rest.
Well, it's nice that one of the major trends in cuisine now is the mocktail, and maybe on some further webinars and videos, we can share some ideas there, of course, to extend the enjoyment during happy hour without alcohol. I'm going to go to, I want to let you know that we are going to go to questions pretty soon. I know we're going to talk about new areas of research down the road, but before we do that, let's go to polling question number 4. And this really does have to do with us planning more educational content for the future. Okay, as we plan ahead, which one of these topics interests you the most? Is it feeding infants and children? Is it shopping, cooking, and recipes? Is it help with safe kitchen tips for neurological challenges? Or is it water, alcohol, and other beverages? And we can see the polling results kind of populating now. And Ann Marie, I'm curious if in our polls you've thought, well, I thought people were going to say that, or wow, that surprises me. Where do you land on that? And more importantly, what do you enjoy and what inspires you the most about working with patients and families who've come to you to learn more about managing their Wilson disease?
Yeah, so I would say the poll results are fairly similar to what I see with patients just wanting to know, what do I eat? Can you give me lists? Can you give me a cookbook? And I hesitate to do that for a lot of things, for any patient I'm working with, because I'm not in your kitchen every single day. I'm not preparing your meals. So I want to empower them to make those food choices. So I hesitate to give meal plans per se, but definitely having more recipes and, cookbook options out there would be ideal. I really love working with this population. I think oftentimes the dietitian is made out to be the food police. So a lot of times we come into, a room to see somebody and say, oh, here's the dietitian. Okay, she can tell me to not eat these foods and can't eat my cake and can't eat, so it's always so negative. I've never had that reaction from a patient with, I shouldn't say never, but I would say the majority of the time not had that reaction from a patient with Wilson disease. They're generally so engaged, so involved, want to know how they can, help improve their health by using nutrition to do that. So it's been really rewarding working with people in this community, especially because there's such little information out there. So they're just really craving information anywhere they can. So I hope to continue to do that, and would love to continue on that journey as we all learn more about how nutrition can help with this diagnosis.
One thing you told me before, Ann Marie, was that you were impressed with how over conscious the Wilson disease folks are with their copper conscious eating. And that's a concern for you too sometimes, right?
Exactly. I would say the bulk of the education I do is actually helping people scale back and calm down what they're doing, because they've gone online and they've read this and they think, I cannot eat these foods ever. So trying to, inform people that you can include these. There are health benefits you're missing out on by cutting whole food groups out. So helping people kind of scale back what they're limiting is actually what I do more, of my education time with, which is kind of unique to most other populations.
Sounds like some great students. And we have some great students here now who have questions for us. And I would like to be able to see the questions. That would be great if you can bring us full screen with the copper conscious eating, and then we'll put Ann Marie and I in a smaller box and I can see the questions. There we go. Okay, so we have one that says low copper diet also means low fiber often. What do you think about that? Is that a side effect of a low copper diet, do you think?
So I think that might be referring to if you are really strictly following it and you're not doing beans, you're not doing the nuts, you're not doing the soy products, you can be missing out some fiber content from that. If you are focusing mostly just on the meats and the lean proteins. But plenty of fruits and vegetables are totally fine to include, especially since we know the copper is less bioavailable and not absorbed as well. So if we go back to that My Plate graphic, if half of your plate is a fruit and vegetable base, that's the bulk of your fiber intake there. With the grains, yes, half the time you're going to do, a more refined grain, so missing out on the fiber, but still can include those whole grains 50% of the time. So that's a way to alternate in some fiber. So I think it's still definitely doable, but if you follow it to the letter and don't have any of those foods, then yes, I see how it could be too low in copper. Excuse me, too low in fiber. Too low in fiber.
Yeah, I can see where that's like, you definitely have to make the choices here, but it would be nice to learn more from nutrition research about how the bioavailability in the vegetable kingdom. Again, call out to our researchers there. We have a couple of questions on following a low copper diet if you're in fact taking zinc supplementation. Does that change the way the information you're giving patients?
So we don't know enough yet about the different types of treatments, the zinc versus the chelators, in terms of how it's going to affect our diet. I haven't seen a big difference in terms of, when you're on this treatment, you're going to have to follow this type of diet. Really, we go based upon the monitoring that Laura referred to in terms of her blood work and the urinalysis that's done to see how her body is doing in terms of total copper content. And that's where we base the diet. So Dr. Shilsky might refer somebody to me who seems like they are struggling and still have higher copper levels. But usually it's not based upon the type of treatment they're on. So more research to come on that. But right now, zinc versus chelators, we don't really change our diet recommendations.
Okay, good to know. And again, just a reminder to folks, this information will be on the Wilson's Disease Association website with all this information. But let's continue. I think that I might jump ahead because it will, I think, help answer some of our questions. about new areas of research that you're excited about, or down the road with the role of nutrition in the management of Wilson's disease.
Yeah, so there's some new things that are starting to come out that are really interesting that might, somewhat change our recommendations. So one such area of research is called epigenetics, and that is happening in a lot of different areas. Epigenetics is the study of how your lifestyle and environment, including food choices, affect and change potentially the way your genes work. So we saw in the video the gene that is altered in Wilson disease, maybe how we read that alteration can be different based on our environment. To support that, there was a really interesting study in 2010 where they had a case report of identical twins that had the exact same genetic mutation for Wilson disease. So their body looked exactly the same in terms of how they had an altered gene. One twin unfortunately ended up progressing to liver disease, liver failure, and needed a liver transplant, whereas the other twin only had very mild liver disease and did not progress to end-stage liver disease. So really interesting to see, they had the exact same mutation or alteration. Why did they present so differently? And can our lifestyle, can our environment, and can our diet impact that? So that would be really exciting to have one more tool to help in that. The other area that I'm excited about is surrounding the microbiome. So the microbiome is the collection of all the good, healthy bacteria and viruses in our body that naturally live there. But it's not standard from person to person. So everybody's kind of healthy bacteria makeup is slightly different. And it might be based on where they grew up, what their diet was, what their age is. Maybe it's genetic related. So there's a lot of research going on in tons of fields: Alzheimer's, diabetes, asthma, heart disease, of can the microbiome, the healthy bacteria in your gut, can the makeup of that change your risk and outcomes with some of these diseases? So with Wilson disease, research is really new in this. There's only been a few small studies, but they did find a difference in the gut flora, the healthy bacteria in your gut, between those with Wilson disease and those without. Those with Wilson disease had less variety in that gut bacteria, and where you get some health benefits is from a more diverse and increased variety in that bacteria. So is that potentially a new target of treatment? Can we change our healthy probiotic intake? Can we change the quality of our diet, bring in more of that fiber to help the gut be more healthy and potentially help Wilson disease outcomes? So hopefully we'll get more information on that in the coming years, but really interesting stuff.
Well, right now, hot off the press is another question, and we have a question about pork. And I did notice in our low, moderate, and high charts that we shared earlier on that bacon was in the low, and yet pork was in the high. Can you give some guidance to our bacon and pork chop loving Wilson's disease patients?
Yeah, so it's going to depend again a bit on the cut of the meat, the fat percentage, potentially where that product was raised and grown. So the copper content is going to vary slightly. The bacon does tend to fall more in that lower category, but again, it's portion size. So watching how much of you're having, because if you have a much bigger portion, it's going to push it up into that next category. So we have it in general in the moderate category pork. So that would be one of those foods that we do say is fine to include, but try to keep it to a 3 to 4 ounce serving, which is about your palm size, and then alternate that. So more often you're having more lean meats like white meat, chicken, turkey, and fish, but definitely fine to include, just not maybe every day and not in larger portions.
It's interesting to me too that there's more copper in the dark meat than the light meat when we talk about poultry. And again, it's that knowing more about like where copper lives, and where it can, and then again, as you mentioned before, where something is grown, where a fish is swimming, and copper being a metal, it's part of the environment, and so it makes sense that it becomes part of the plant and or animal that's in that terroir, if you will.
But then also knowing what the end outcome is that we're trying to achieve. If we have somebody stick to this super strict 1 milligram a day, are they going to have tremendously better outcomes than somebody who sticks to 1.5 milligrams? And we just don't have that data yet. So until we have that, I don't feel comfortable telling people, make sure you add up every single milligram. Now, somebody like Amanda, who can definitely see the impact on her body and is listening to her body and knows what works for her, that's wonderful and amazing to have that, kind of trigger and know, okay, this is too much for me. For others who maybe don't have that, I don't want people to be so stressed about their eating, thinking I can never have these foods, because we just don't know yet how important it is to be that strict with it.
Are we able to go back to the results of the polling question that we had about what interests you most? Let's see how that played out. Shopping, cooking, and recipes. This is what we're talking about right now. Look at that. That is incredible. That is okay. It looks like we've got our work cut out for us to spend more time in the grocery store and in the kitchen, in which we're going to bring in Laura and Amanda in just a moment. But while we're doing that, speaking of shopping, cooking, and recipes, what about dining out, Ann Marie? Any advice, any cautions, any tips for navigating a restaurant menu, something folks might not think about?
Yeah, so it's definitely reasonable to be dining out with Wilson disease. I think most of the recommendations I would have would be ones I would have similarly for anybody trying to maintain a healthy diet, because when you're eating out at restaurants, usually portion control is not something that is number one on their list. So we tend to get larger portions. We tend to get more added sugar and salt in things because it's a cheap way to make things taste good and enhance the flavor of the cooking. So those are some more of the tricks to kind of think about in terms of maintaining long-term liver health. You can always look at menus online now, which is nice. So you can look ahead of time and kind of be prepared, knowing that if it's that once a year or twice a year, you're going to have one of those higher copper shellfish, go ahead and have that. But otherwise, sticking with the lean meats, sticking with egg-based dishes, pasta dishes, and just monitoring overall portion size. With things like soups and sauces, that's where most of the added sodium is going to be. So we usually recommend foregoing a soup and do a salad instead. And then anything with lots of sauce or dressing, just ask for that on the side so that you can add some for flavor, but not have as much of those additives with that.
One good thing in the restaurant world, and I write a lot about dining out in my journalism on food and nutrition, is that have you noticed now when you dine out, the server will usually say, do we have any allergies at the table? They're really, really hip to that, if you will. And so what's cool about that is, I would imagine as a Wilson disease patient, let's say you're trying to avoid nuts, okay? You're trying to avoid those raisins. You're not going to get as much pushback today about, being the one that asks all the questions. Do you feel a difference now when in restaurants and working with folks?
Yeah, for sure. So like you mentioned, people just being so much aware of different nutritional needs, whether it's a lifestyle choice, whether it's an allergy base, and restaurants are attuned to that and want to cater to their customers. So again, this is a much newer thing. So it's not as common, as I can't have nuts or I can't have milk. Or I have a dairy allergy, but down the road, maybe it will be. And we can say, I need to, monitor these few foods in my diet. So I think restaurants are becoming more aware of that. And it's definitely something that as we have that research and say, for sure, we know this is best to do, then hopefully they'll help us out with that.
And again, back of the house, they usually have the nuts and the different things separated out, and they know not to add it because there'd be other people who are concerned about it. Why don't we bring in Amanda? I think we may not have Laura at the moment, but let's bring in Amanda, because Amanda, there's Laura. Look at that. Miracles. Love it. Do you have questions for Ann Marie? I mean, the dietitian is in.
I actually do have a question, and it relates to the end of the vegan and vegetarian protein options. The only protein option I really saw when I was researching that would be low copper option would be seitan. Would you agree with that? I mean, other than obviously if you're gluten sensitive, you can't, that's not really a great option, but would you say that it's a good option as a low copper protein?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is totally fine to include for protein if you're avoiding animal-based products. Using the beans, using the nuts, using the soy, those are things that wouldn't be the base of your diet, but those might be incorporated, say maybe once a week you do have a tofu-based meal. So I think it doesn't need to be your only protein source, but I think emphasis on the seitan to begin with, and then alternating in the other products are definitely fine. As I mentioned before, if you are okay with adding in the dairy or the eggs, that's a very easy low copper choice. But for somebody strictly following vegan, it does get a little more challenging. So would recommend working with a dietitian if you can. And then just working with your doctor to monitor your levels, because if your body is responding well to treatment and your copper levels are stable, then there's no reason we can't add in some of those higher copper foods a little more often and just see how your body responds to them.
Which brings us to Laura. Laura, I remember that you were a bit of a mushroom lover and missed that. You have a question for Ann Marie.
Yep. Ann Marie, I'm just interested in, would you provide any advice? What advice would you provide to a parent on how to incorporate good, nutritious meals for the family when one person has Wilson's disease?
Yeah, so I think that is really important to think about, because a lot of times, we'll see people say, well, I can eat this and you can eat that, and we kind of segment all of our meals. But, a lot of the research shows that family meals and eating together with our children can really help to create lifelong good habits. So I think it's definitely reasonable to do, because, again, there's very few foods we're saying do not eat. Do not eat liver, moderate, really try to minimize the shellfish. But beyond that, with the fruits and vegetables, you can have all of those things in a week. Maybe the moderate ones, maybe you only have those once a week. And that's why when I go back to that kind of cheat sheet at the end, start with these fruits and vegetables, make those the base of your diet, and then alternate and bring in the others maybe 1 to 2 days per week. But really helping kids set that foundation of that 50% of their plate from fruits and veggies. There's a lot of other tips and tricks out there about how to introduce kids to them, how to make it fun, how to involve them in the cooking and the shopping process, so they have some ownership and feel like they've helped to plan that meal. So I think that's a great point to make, and don't think you should feel over restricted that you can't introduce those foods to your kids as part of your family meals.
Thank you.
Does that make you think of another question, Laura or Amanda? I will bring one up. Go ahead.
I was going to just say, I think you've explained it pretty well, but for somebody that's had Wilson's disease for 25 years versus a newly diagnosed person with Wilson's disease, it would be a big difference in your approach in speaking with them.
Yeah, and that's a question somebody put in the chat here is, why in the first year is it that much different? So, in that first year of treatment, you're not only trying to prevent your body from absorbing further copper, but helping to try and get rid of some of the copper your body has built up and has stored. So that first year of treatment, there's really a lot of change happening with trying to pull that copper out and trying to prevent further uptake of the copper. So that's why we're definitely more strict in that first year. So we would definitely spend more time with somebody who's newly diagnosed and help them try to navigate it and start them off on the right foot, versus somebody who's done it for a long time. They figured out what works for them. Maybe it's not exactly what I would recommend, but if they've found what works for them, and their medical treatment is going well, there's really no reason to adjust that. It's not something that we're going to have them change. So I think it does vary depending on where you are in the treatment course.
And somebody here has asked about meal replacement drinks, about chia. We have so many specific questions, which is kind of exciting.
So I saw that about the chia. The chia is interesting. I don't know. I haven't looked into that specifically, but could play around with that on the Food Data Central to see If somebody has a sec, maybe they can pull it up. We could see the copper content, but I'll get those type of questions a lot. What about this food? What about that food? And I've never really sat down to think about it. So that's something that we learn and explore together. Another question that popped up, what does less frequently mean? And I know that's frustrating because, dietitians want to talk in generalities and patients want, okay, tell me how many days a week can I eat this? Can I eat it once? Can I eat it twice? And I hesitate to give that really specific recommendation because, again, for somebody who's maybe adjusting their treatments and their copper levels are higher and it's not working as well for them, maybe that's a little less often for them versus somebody who is very stable. Maybe they can have it more frequently. So I would say in general, with the very high copper foods, the shellfish, we would say after the first year, maybe have those once or twice a year. With the other high copper foods, I would say maybe those are fine to have, let's say, once a week in the portion size that's listed if your levels are stable. And then the moderate ones are fine to include as long as you're having them in the portion size. But again, then 6 months later, you check in with your physician. How is my treatment going? And if you need to pull back more, that's when you would work with a dietitian to say, okay, where should I cut back? So it's really about navigating, and adjusting over time based on how you're responding to treatment.
Amanda, I want to get back to
you.
Yes.
So back to the chia seed question. I just looked it up on the nutritiondata.com. And they say that the copper is 0.1, so that would be in the mid-range, correct, of copper content. So it would be a moderate.
0.1 for what portion size is that? Does it say?
Because chia seeds you don't use that much of. You know what I mean?
Right.
Per ounce.
Yeah. So that's
and again, as a dietitian, we don't know if that's 1 ounce plumped up or 1 ounce of the dry, right? Which then plumps up to 1. So again, this is a lot of fun. And back to Laura talking about family, this goes back to the tiniest person in the family. We have a question about, are there any recommendations for how to manage breastfeeding? Diet during breastfeeding. Any thoughts there, Ann Marie?
Yeah, I have looked into that before because I've had people ask me. My understanding is that the copper content of breast milk is based on what we call active transport, not passive transport. So what that means is your body actively puts a set amount of copper into the breast milk. Passively, if it did it that way, would mean if you have a much higher intake, much more is going to diffuse into the breast milk. So that is not how it works with copper content, is my understanding. So I've always said that generally the copper content of breast milk, even for somebody on treatment, is going to be adequate for the baby because the physicians, would always leave your body with enough copper that you need. So then therefore you would be able to appropriately nourish your baby with that.
Why don't we go to another polling question? Because it would be very interesting to find out the answer to this question. And here we go. How did you hear about this webinar? Was it in the Wilson Disease Association newsletter? Was it the Wilson Disease Association website? Was it social media? Or was it through a friend or a family member? We would love to know so that we can really work on our outreach to more folks. Hey, look at this. Social media was winning, and now it's the newsletter. Look at that. This is very, very exciting to see what is working. And thank you for reading the newsletter. We'll have more information, hopefully, on copper conscious eating there as well. And look at those great family and friends that are also helping out. That's terrific. Let's go back to our guests here. And this has been terrific. I want to spend some time just wrapping up here, thanking everybody. And it has just been terrific. Any final comments, Ann Marie, Amanda, and Laura?
Yeah, I would encourage you to focus on your I cans and not your I can'ts. It's a much easier thing to embrace. And I noticed there's a question that I was just going to answer real quick. I
started noticing my neurological issues. Like if I have nuts, I can see a difference in my my tremors within like 24 hours. But I have been living on a fairly strict end of the diet of low copper, but I do kind of a copper chaser, because sometimes it's a question of when was the last time that I've had a super high copper thing. If it hasn't been in a while, then I get a dark chocolate, and that kind of helps even me out. But if I've been overloading on the high copper and I'm having tremors, then I make sure that I really need to cut back, maybe take a little bit more zinc to help chelate a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And actually, we are bumping into the end of time, and I think it's terrific that we've had so much to talk about and more to talk about ahead. Thank you, everyone. It is time to say goodbye, and thank you to everyone attending this webinar now and in the future during the recording, organized by the Wilson Disease Association. And thank you, of course, to our special guests, Laura Kalt, Amanda Elsts, and of course, Ann Marie Rivard. And a big thank you to our sponsors, Ultragenics and Alexion Pharmaceuticals. If you'd like to watch this webinar again or share it, you will find it on the Wilson Disease Association website and YouTube channel. I'm Carolyn O'Neil. I thoroughly enjoyed moderating this marvelous webinar, and I wish everyone out there great health, the best of food and health. Thank you so much for joining us.